The first time I saw Greg, it was raining. Not the soft, misty drizzle Eastwick was known for, but a steady, determined downpour that left the streets glistening and the air thick with petrichor. I had ducked into Whitmore's bookshop to wait it out, fingers trailing the spines of novels I'd already read and a few I told myself I'd someday get to. And that's when I noticed him. Not because of his height or the broadness of his shoulders, though both were hard to miss, but because of the little girl in the yellow raincoat holding tightly to his hand like he was her anchor in a world too loud. Her eyes, gray like a sky just before a storm, studied everything and everyone with quiet caution. She didn't speak, didn't squirm. She just stood beside him, tiny fingers curled around his palm, as if she'd memorized the feel of safety. Greg smiled politely at the store owner who was announcing the start of the author Q&A, then crouched to whisper something to the girl. She nodded once and leaned against his leg, yellow hood still up. I don't know what compelled me to sit next to them, but I did. Maybe it was the way Greg's eyes lit up when he laughed softly at the author's dry humor. Or maybe it was how Isla, her name, I'd later learn, watched everyone but never let go of her father's sleeve. After the event, we bumped into each other again in the children's section. I had wandered there without intention, scanning picture books out of some lingering nostalgia. Greg was kneeling beside Isla, reading the Gruffalo in a funny voice that had her biting back laughter. When our eyes met, he smiled, tired but genuine. She loves this one, he said. Even though she could probably recite it backward by now. I do the voices too, I said before I could overthink it. But mostly for my niece. Or, I used to. She's a teenager now and far too cool for Gruffalos. That made him chuckle and something eased between us. Introductions followed. Greg, Isla, me. We lingered. Talked about books. About the rain. About how hard it was to get kids to eat vegetables and how bedtime stories somehow became negotiations. Isla didn't say a word. But she watched me. Not with suspicion, more like she was gathering data, deciding whether I was worth the effort. Her eyes met mine once. I smiled. She didn't smile back, but she didn't look away either. Over the next few weeks, Greg and I started to see more of each other. First coffee, then walks through the Eastwick market, then dinners in cozy places where the lighting was soft and the tables small. Always, Isla was there. And always, she kept her distance. She would color at the table, or hum to herself, or sit between us like a wall and a bridge all at once. Greg told me bits and pieces about her mother, Celeste. How she left when Isla was barely 2. No dramatic exits, just a note and a silence that stretched into years. I never pressed. Greg spoke like a man who'd learned to live around the ache. And Isla? She didn't ask about her mother. Not when she skinned her knee and wanted only Greg's arms. Not when she drew pictures of families that were always 2 people, not 3. One Saturday afternoon, Greg asked if I'd help Isla with a school project, something about building a diorama of the solar system. He had a shift at the hospital and couldn't get out of it. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure if Isla would want me to. But when he asked her, she looked at me, really looked at me, and gave the tiniest shrug. We spent hours cutting styrofoam and painting planets with more glitter than NASA would approve of. She didn't talk much, but when I accidentally glued Earth to my sleeve, she laughed, an actual laugh that caught me off guard and filled the room. And when I helped her carry the project into her classroom Monday morning, she reached for my hand. From then on, things shifted. She started calling me Mimi. I never asked her to. One day, she just did. It wasn't Mom. It wasn't even Marla. It was her own thing, her own word for whatever space I had started to take up in her world. And I cherished it. I became part of the rhythms of their life. Bedtime stories, school pickups, Saturday pancakes. She asked me to braid her hair for school picture day. She cried into my shoulder when her goldfish died. I framed one of her drawings, a scribbly, heart-laden mess of Greg, Isla, and me under a rainbow. She'd crawl into bed beside me on stormy nights, still in that same yellow raincoat that had become too small, but she refused to give up. "It's my brave coat," she once whispered, eyes wide and sleepy. I wore it when I met you." I smiled into her hair, holding her close. "You were very brave," I told her. "And I'm so glad you did." And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't just Greg's girlfriend. I wasn't just someone passing through. I was something solid to Isla. A presence she reached for. A voice she trusted. A hand she held when she needed anchoring. And that meant everything. The first time Isla called me Mom, it wasn't with ceremony. There wasn't some big reveal or emotional crescendo like in the movies. No orchestral swell or slow-motion moment. It happened on a Tuesday. She'd scraped her knee tripping over a crack in the sidewalk while running into the house after school. I dropped the grocery bags and rushed to her, kneeling beside her in the gravel. Tears welled in her eyes, her lip trembling, and she cried, "Mom, it hurts." I froze, not from offense, not from confusion, but from the suddenness of it. She didn't even notice. She just threw her arms around my neck, trusting me to hold her pain the way I always had. I kissed the crown of her head and whispered, "I've got you, baby. I've got you." Later, she called me Mimi again like nothing had changed. But it had. A seed had rooted. I never told Greg about that moment. It was mine. Ours. Becoming Isla's full-time caregiver was gradual, unspoken. Greg's shifts grew longer, hospital demands more intense. At first, I volunteered, taking Isla to her ballet lessons, packing her lunches, sitting in the audience with tear-brimmed eyes as she leapt across the stage in her tiny pink slippers. Eventually, volunteering became routine. Routine became necessity. Necessity became identity. Mimi meant scraped knees and early morning fevers. Mimi meant helping her write an apology note after snapping at her best friend in 3rd grade. Mimi was the one she handed her crumpled Valentine's card to when her first middle school crush ghosted her the day after the dance. I wanted to protect her from everything and yet knew I never truly could. Greg saw it all, of course. Sometimes he thanked me with a kiss pressed to my temple or a coffee delivered without asking. Sometimes he took it for granted, like most people do with Constance. But I didn't mind. Isla was the axis my world spun around now. And then came the years of change. Teenagers are fragile, slippery creatures. One moment Isla clung to me like a lifeline, the next she barricaded herself in her room over a group chat misfire or an unfair grade. But through it all, through the slammed doors, the tears, the wild laughter, the too loud music, I remained her center. I was the one she called from sleepovers to say goodnight. The one she confessed her dreams to, the painting program at Arden University, the possibility of studying abroad, the terrifying thrill of becoming someone new. Celeste, in contrast, flickered in and out like a ghost with a decent Wi-Fi connection. She sent holiday texts. Posted grainy throwbacks on Instagram captioned with things like, "My little star, so proud of the woman you're becoming." She sent a birthday card once with no return address. Isla showed it to me, rolled her eyes, then asked if I could bake her favorite vanilla cake. I tried not to resent Celeste. I tried not to let the bitterness plant roots. But when you've kissed fevers away and wiped away tears and spent hours scouring Target for the exact shade of teal backpack a 13-year-old swears will literally ruin her life if it's wrong, it's hard not to feel territorial. And then came graduation day. Isla had spent weeks preparing for it, picking the perfect dress, curling her hair in my bathroom, adjusting the cap over and over while asking if it made her look too academic. Greg stood with his phone in hand like a proud paparazzi. I stood behind the camera, always a step back. That had become our quiet understanding, my presence, not my spotlight. When she walked across the stage and shook hands with the dean, I swore I'd never felt prouder. I cheered like an idiot. I cried when she tossed her cap into the air. And when she found me afterward in the parking lot, amid the chaos of parents and confetti and car horns, she didn't hesitate. She ran to me, full speed, and wrapped her arms around my waist. "You're my mom," she said into my shoulder, voice cracking. In every way that counts. I held her, fingers trembling, not because I doubted it, but because some small part of me had waited so long to hear it out loud. "You always have been," she whispered. And that was it. That was everything. Later that night, Greg poured wine in the kitchen and kissed my cheek. "We did good," he said. I nodded, but deep inside, I held onto her words like a keepsake. Like proof that the years hadn't just passed, they'd meant something. Every bedtime story, every science fair project, every tearful heart-to-heart about middle school drama had been real, had mattered. In that moment, I believed we were unshakable. I believed that love, earned love, would always be stronger than biology, stronger than history, stronger than the absences that once defined Isla's life. I didn't know then how fragile even the strongest bonds can become when tested by something as simple and as cruel as the desire for a picture-perfect moment. Supporting Isla through college became second nature, not something I paused to evaluate. Arden University was just over an hour away from Eastwick, but to Isla, it may as well have been another planet. She left in a whirlwind of dorm assignments, supply checklists, and nervous excitement. I stood by the car as she waved from the passenger seat, Greg behind the wheel, and I remember thinking, this is what all those years had been leading toward. Letting her go. Trusting that what I poured into her would carry her forward. But letting go doesn't come clean. It clings. I was the one she called that first cold night when her roommate brought a boyfriend over, and they started arguing at 1 a.m. I sat up in bed, listened to her vent until she calmed down, then Venmo'd her enough for a hot breakfast the next morning. Coffee fixes more than people admit, I told her. She laughed and called me her lifesaver. It wasn't long before I offered to help her move into an off-campus apartment. Her dorm had turned into a war zone of mismatched personalities, and her anxiety was spiraling. Greg and I drove down with boxes and groceries. I helped her hang fairy lights and pin up Polaroids on the corkboard. She clung to me tighter than she had at 5 years old. "Are you sure this is okay?" she asked. "I know it's expensive. And it's not your responsibility." "It is," I interrupted gently. "You are." She hugged me then, so fiercely, and I thought, this is the kind of motherhood no one sees. Not the labor, not the birth. The quiet choices. The steady yes. The invisible stitching. Celeste made one appearance during college, just once. It was the sorority banquet during Isla's junior year. I didn't know she'd be there. Neither did Isla, judging by the tension that fell over her face when she spotted her biological mother gliding across the ballroom in a silk dress and 2 high heels, camera already in hand. "Smile, sweetheart," Celeste had said, loud enough to make Isla stiffen. "My gorgeous girl, you look just like me in that color." I stood a few steps back, watching them. Isla forced a smile, let her take the photo. But her eyes sought mine the moment it was done. Celeste left before dessert, the scent of her perfume lingering longer than her presence. That night, Isla came back to my hotel room and collapsed on the bed. She said nothing for a long time. I sat beside her, fingers combing gently through her curls. Finally, she whispered, "I hate that I want her to want me." I didn't try to fix it. I just held her hand and reminded her of what she did have. That love doesn't come in only one form. That she was already wanted. Already chosen. Senior year brought more stress, finals, job applications, endless what-ifs. I drove to Arden on more than one late night with soup and supplies. I never told Greg every detail. He was proud of her, but in that passive, distant way that left room for other things. I was the one she cried to when she failed her statistics midterm. The one who helped her rewrite cover letters and printed 25 resumes on heavy linen paper. And then she graduated. I bought her a pearl bracelet for the occasion, small, elegant, something she could wear to interviews. Greg and I stood clapping in the packed auditorium as Isla crossed the stage in her cap and gown. Her eyes swept the crowd until they found us. Found me. I swear, even from a distance, I saw the tears forming. Afterward, we hugged under the oak trees just outside the main hall. Isla was sobbing, mascara streaking down her cheeks, and she whispered, "I couldn't have done this without you." "You did it," I replied. "I just stood in the wings." "No," she said, gripping my hands, "you were the whole stage." That moment carved itself into me. The way she said it. The way she looked at me like I was her beginning and her anchor. The sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the endless support, it had all led to this. A love that had been chosen again and again, not because of blood, but because of presence. I let myself believe it was unshakable. That no one could walk in now, not after all of it, and rewrite what we had built. Isla had grown up in my arms. I had kissed every skin knee, clapped for every recital, and cried for her when she didn't know how to cry for herself. Surely that counted. Surely that was what motherhood meant. But I didn't know how easily even the strongest bonds can be rewritten with the flick of a pen and a few elegant words on expensive stationery. And I didn't yet know how much it would hurt when the curtain finally fell, and I realized I'd been part of the show, but not the cast she listed in the program. The envelope was beautiful. Thick, creamy paper, the kind that held a scent of expensive decisions. My name was written in gold ink, in Isla's handwriting, the same loopy, artistic letters I'd watched evolve from spelling tests to thank you notes. I was standing at the kitchen island when I opened it, sunlight spilling across the marble counter like it had no idea it was about to witness something shattering. Inside was the invitation to Isla and Troy's wedding. I smiled at first. I'd been waiting for it, of course. Isla had called the night after he proposed, breathless and giddy. He did it in the botanical garden, she had said, squealing into the phone. With fairy lights and everything. I had squealed back, laughed with her, already picturing the venue, the dress, the tears we'd shed together during the planning. We'd even gone dress shopping. She'd asked me to be there for every step. So when I opened the envelope, I expected something joyful. Confirmation of what I already knew, that I was part of it. Not just part of it, foundational. But then I saw it. My name. Marla Bennett. Just that. No, Mimi. No, mother of the bride. No acknowledgement of who I had been for her every day since she was 5. Below that, listed in delicate script, was the program. Mother of the bride, Celeste Reed. Processional escort and toast. I stared at it for a long time. Read the words again. And again. I must have blinked 10 times before the meaning sunk in. Guessed. I wasn't standing with her. I wasn't walking her down the aisle. I wasn't giving a speech or a toast. I wasn't even a bridesmaid. I was just attending, as if I were distant family. An aunt. A coworker. A +1. I didn't cry right away. Shock is quiet. It doesn't scream. It hums just beneath your skin, a disorienting buzz that makes you question your reality. I picked up my phone to call her, then stopped. What was I going to say? That I deserved more? That she had made some kind of mistake? Maybe she had. Maybe it was just an oversight. But it wasn't. Later that evening, I sat with Greg on the porch, the envelope resting on my lap like a secret. The sunset painted the sky a bruised pink, and he was talking about work, but I couldn't hear him. Finally, I placed the card on the table and turned it toward him. He read it once. Then again. His face didn't change much, just that quiet wrinkle between his brows. I'm sure she didn't mean it like that. Greg, I said, my voice dry. She listed Celeste. For the walk. For the speech. She called me a guest. He looked at me then, really looked, and I could see something shift behind his eyes. He wanted to believe it was nothing, the way I wanted to believe it was everything. But neither of us said what we were really thinking. I didn't sleep that night. The questions circled like vultures. Had I missed something? Had Isla been pulling away without me noticing? Or had I simply never held the place I thought I did? Days passed. I tried to be reasonable. I told myself titles didn't matter. That what we shared couldn't be defined by a program. That this was just a symbolic misstep. But grief doesn't care about symbols. It cares about the wound. I helped her with the florist anyway. I booked the deposit for Meadow Lake Gardens after she texted that she loved the willow trees there. I even drove out to tour the space with her, smiling as she imagined walking barefoot down the path, eyes locked on Troy. She showed me fabric swatches for the bridesmaid dresses, asked my opinion on candlelight versus fairy lights, made me taste 3 different lemon fillings for the cake. And I did it. All of it. Because that's what mothers do, even when their title is erased in ink. But it chipped away at me. The night before the wedding, I laid out my dress alone. A simple navy gown. Nothing showy, nothing that would draw attention. Greg was at the hotel bar nursing a drink, and I sat on the edge of the bed, looking out over the garden view, and wondered how many other women had played the role of mother only to be quietly dismissed when the curtain rose. The morning of the ceremony, I arrived early. I helped Isla zip her gown, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and whispered, "You look radiant." She smiled and held my hand for a moment too long, and I let myself believe she was feeling what I was feeling, that unspoken ache between us. But then Celeste arrived. She swept in like she belonged there. Bright, elegant, her smile gleaming for the cameras. She pulled Isla into a hug, lipstick kissing her cheek. "Ready to walk you down the aisle, baby girl?" she cooed. And Isla nodded. She nodded. I took my seat in the third row. Not the front. I didn't want the front. Not anymore. When Celeste stood and took Isla's arm, when they walked down the aisle to murmurs and sighs, when the officiant said, "Mother of the bride," and everyone turned to look at Celeste, there was no mention of me. No nod. No thank you. Not even a glance. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't just lost a title. I'd lost my place. The morning after the wedding, I stood at the hotel sink, washing the remnants of mascara from beneath my eyes, watching the water swirl black and gray before disappearing down the drain. My body felt like it had been through something physical, as if grief had curled itself around my muscles and pulled tight. I wasn't angry yet. Not fully. I was still hovering in the disbelief. Still wondering if maybe, just maybe, there had been a last-minute mix-up. Maybe they hadn't realized how it would look. Maybe Isla hadn't meant to make me invisible. But when I asked her, when I finally sat across from her in the bridal suite, surrounded by tissue paper and lipstick-stained champagne flutes, she didn't flinch. "She gave birth to me," she said, her voice gentle but firm. I wanted her to have this one moment. One moment. All the years we'd shared, 18 of them, distilled into a footnote. Isla spoke the words like they were logical, even reasonable, and I'm sure in her mind they were. I stared at her face, searching for guilt, for hesitation, for some small signal that she understood what she'd done. But she just looked tired. Happy. Married. Moved on. My throat tightened, but I didn't argue. I simply nodded, because what else could I do? Scream? Demand she rewrite the entire wedding? Rip the memories from yesterday and splice myself back into them? Instead, I went back to my room, packed my suitcase slowly, and drove home alone. I didn't cry until I saw the drawing. It was framed in the hallway, Isla's stick-figure family from when she was 8. 3 people under a rainbow, her, Greg, and me. My family scrawled in purple crayon. It had hung there for years, a quiet affirmation of everything we'd built. I stood there staring at it, and the tears came silently, hot and fast, soaking the collar of my blouse. Later, Greg came home from picking up Isla's leftover decorations from the venue. He walked in like nothing had shifted, placed a box of vases on the table, and asked if I wanted to heat up leftovers. "No," I said. "I need to talk." He stiffened, shoulders rising slightly, like he'd been bracing for this. He said nothing, just waited. I told him everything, how I'd felt, what Isla had said, how I'd stood there in the crowd watching another woman wear my title like a designer coat. I told him how the toast Celeste gave was a story from Isla's infancy, how it ended with, "Being your mother has been my greatest honor," and the room erupted in applause. "And me?" I said, my voice cracking. "I was the woman who paid for the cake." Greg sighed, ran a hand through his hair. "She didn't mean it like that, Marla. It was one moment. You're still the one who raised her." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I was her mother until it was time for the photos. He flinched. "She chose Celeste," I said. "And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's her right. But I can't pretend it didn't break something in me." Greg said nothing for a long time. Then he asked, "Are you going to stop loving her now?" "No," I said, and meant it. "But I'm going to stop pretending I don't exist in the shadows." The weeks that followed were strange. The house in Willowbend, once filled with wedding chatter and dress fittings and menu planning, grew quiet. Greg moved through it like he was avoiding my eyes. And I didn't chase after his comfort. I sat with my grief, let it wash over me in waves, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't reach for someone else's need before acknowledging my own pain. Isla called occasionally. Breezy check-ins. Hey, we're back from the mini-moon. We loved Santoria Bay. The food was insane. Each time, I waited for something more. An acknowledgement. A whisper of regret. But it never came. It was as if the wedding hadn't left a scar at all. I listened. I smiled. I asked polite questions. But my heart had shifted. And then, 2 weeks later, she called again. Her voice was bright, the way it always was when she was dancing around something. We went a little over budget, she said, laughing like it wasn't a big deal. The photographer charged more than expected, and the Airbnb in Santoria Bay had hidden fees. We just need a little help covering some of it. Would that be okay? I stood in the kitchen, staring at the island where her wedding invitation still sat tucked beneath a pile of magazines I couldn't bring myself to move. My voice came out calm, measured. Maybe your mom can help, I said. Silence. She seemed front and center at the wedding, I added. More silence. Then a clipped breath, the sharp edge of surprise. I understand, she said. And hung up. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding not with regret, but with something close to relief. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't begged for recognition. I had simply set a boundary. And she had heard it. For the first time since the yellow raincoat, since the solar system diorama, since the scraped knees and whispered secrets, I wasn't rushing in to rescue her. And maybe that was the start of something real. Or the end of something broken. 2 weeks. That's how long it took for Isla to pick up the phone and call me, like nothing had cracked open between us. She sounded radiant, like she'd been dipped in honeymoon sun and wrapped in saltwater breezes. Santoria Bay was incredible, she said, breathless with the energy of someone still floating in rose petals and room service. Troy surprised me with a couple's massage. And the sunsets, Mom, you wouldn't believe them. They looked fake. She still called me Mom, I noticed. That word used to land in my chest like sunlight. Now it thudded against a bruise I hadn't figured out how to name. I let her talk. Let her paint Santoria Bay in watercolor words while I sat at the kitchen table in Willowbend, my tea going cold. She had no idea how much I'd practiced this, keeping my voice even, smiling when I didn't feel it, pretending her stories didn't scrape over a sore spot still too raw to touch. And then came the pivot. So, she said, drawing the words out like they were made of glass, we did go a little over budget. There it was. The photographer was more than expected, she added quickly. And there were surprise fees at the Airbnb. You know how that goes. I stayed quiet. And, well, she hesitated, the bright lilt in her voice dipping. I was wondering if you might be able to help out a little? Nothing crazy, just to cover the overflow. I stared out the window. The hydrangeas I'd planted last spring were starting to wither. The sun had been too harsh this summer. Or maybe they were just tired. Maybe we all were. I took a slow breath. Maybe your mom can help, I said, carefully, like each syllable was a step on thin ice. A pause. She seemed pretty front and center at the wedding. Silence stretched on the line. I imagined Isla sitting on her couch, phone pressed to her ear, eyes wide. It wasn't a cruel thing I'd said. It wasn't even a jab. It was just true. Celeste had floated through every frame of that wedding like royalty. She gave the toast. She held Isla's hand as she walked toward her new life. She took all the credit, all the camera angles, all the words. And I had let her. Isla started, then stopped. I understand. Then she hung up. I stared at the blank screen for a long time. My reflection glared back from the black glass. Who was I now? Not the bride's mother. Not the rescuer. Just the fallback who finally said no. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there, letting the quiet settle over me. It was heavier than anger. Sadder than grief. It was the sound of love being rerouted. Later that evening, Greg came home and noticed the silence. "She call?" he asked, tossing his keys into the bowl by the door. "She did. And?" "She needed money." He stopped mid-step, turning to look at me. "And you told her no?" "I told her to ask her mom." The words landed hard. He blinked once. "Marla, come on. It's Isla. She's our daughter." "She is. But not when it counts. That's not fair." "No, Greg. What wasn't fair was being listed as a guest after raising her for 18 years. What wasn't fair was sitting quietly while Celeste played mother in front of our friends and family. And now she wants me to do what I've always done, fix the mess, cover the gap, make it all okay." His jaw tensed, but he didn't speak. I stood, my tea now cold enough to discard. If Celeste is the mother of the bride, then maybe she can be the one to write the check. I walked out of the kitchen and didn't look back. That night, I sat in the art room I hadn't touched in months. Canvases lined the walls, old brushes stiff in their jars. I stared at the half-finished painting of Isla and me at the lake from years ago. She was laughing, arms around my neck, sun casting gold over our hair. I'd painted it the night she got accepted to Arden. I picked up a brush and thought about painting over it, about starting something new. But I didn't. I just stood there, letting the memory breathe. I wasn't sure what I was to her anymore. A backup? A fallback? A silent presence she leaned on when needed, but never acknowledged? I didn't want revenge. I didn't want her to suffer, but I wanted her to understand. To really see the difference between someone who gave her a name and someone who gave her everything else. And if she couldn't see that, if she chose not to, then maybe I needed to stop waiting for the recognition that would never come. Not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. That night, I slept through without dreaming. The first time in weeks. And in the quiet of morning, I didn't check my phone. I didn't wait for an apology or another request. Instead, I poured fresh tea, sat by the window, and watched the hydrangeas slowly fade, petals curling inward, not dying, just preparing to grow back differently. Greg's silence had weight to it now. It wasn't the comfortable kind, the kind we used to share while reading in bed or sitting in the garden, content in the nearness of each other. This silence was jagged. It clung to the walls of the house like fog, thick and chilled, turning every glance into a question and every word into a potential landmine. He didn't bring it up right away. He pretended for a while. He moved through the house like a man performing an old role he no longer believed in, setting his keys on the hook, kissing my cheek without really meeting my eyes, asking if I'd eaten like that somehow tethered us back to what we used to be. It was 4 days after Isla hung up that he finally snapped. "She called me," he said one evening, leaning in the doorway while I folded laundry in the guest room. His tone was neutral, but his fingers gripped the frame too tightly. I didn't look up. I figured she would. "She's upset." "I'm not surprised." He stepped into the room, that tension coiling in his shoulders like it had nowhere else to go. "She doesn't understand why you said what you said. Why you won't help her." I set a towel down on the bed, folding it with practiced calm. "Then she hasn't been listening. She's your daughter, Marla." I finally looked at him. She was. Until it was time for the photos. The words hit the air like a slap. He blinked as if they physically stung, and for a second I felt it, that old guilt rising in my throat, begging me to back down, to soften. But I didn't. I'd swallowed too many of my own feelings for too long. "She made a choice," I continued, voice even. "She decided Celeste was the mother she wanted everyone to see. And I respected that. I sat where I was told. I clapped. I smiled. I gave her that day, Greg. But she doesn't get to come back after all that and expect me to pretend it didn't happen. She didn't mean to hurt you. That doesn't make it hurt less." He looked away, rubbing his jaw. "You're punishing her." I laughed once, bitter and short. "No. I'm just not saving her. There's a difference." We didn't speak much after that. Not that day. Not the day after. The house in Willowbend turned cold with unspoken things, the air thicker with each silent dinner, and each door left slightly ajar but never crossed. Meanwhile, I heard bits and pieces through the grapevine. Isla and Troy were struggling. Celeste, unsurprisingly, was unresponsive. She'd been the star for one day, long enough to bask in the spotlight, to collect the applause and retreat once the curtain fell. I wasn't surprised. Isla should have known better. Deep down, maybe she did. Rent was overdue. Troy had picked up extra shifts. They were arguing more. I didn't gloat. I didn't take pleasure in any of it. I just sat with the weight of it all, the love I'd given so fully, the way it had been brushed aside like an afterthought. One morning, Greg dropped a letter on the counter before leaving for work. No envelope. Just folded notebook paper. "I know you're hurt," it read. "But you're still her mother. Whether you're called one or not. And mothers don't walk away." I stared at the words for a long time. No signature. He didn't need one. I folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer, not sure whether I wanted to keep it close or forget it existed. Later that afternoon, I walked into Isla's old room. It still looked like hers, even after all this time. Posters from high school, fairy lights around the mirror, a dusty stack of college notebooks on the desk. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air. I sat on the edge of her bed and let myself remember it all, the tears she cried into my shoulder when her first boyfriend dumped her, the nights we whispered in the dark during thunderstorms, the mornings we danced in the kitchen in our socks to Taylor Swift. I hadn't been perfect. I'd made mistakes. Lost my patience. Said the wrong thing. But I had shown up. Over and over again. And that had to count for something. Hadn't it? Downstairs, I heard the door open. Greg was home again, moving through the house like a ghost, like he didn't quite know where he fit anymore either. And maybe that was the cruelest part of all of this, not that Isla had chosen Celeste, not that she'd minimized me, but that the fracture had spread. That now, even in my own home, love had become something delicate. Something fragile. Something easily misunderstood. I used to believe love was unshakable if you built it carefully enough. That if you did the work, if you kept showing up, it would hold. That family was about presence, not blood. But now I wasn't sure. I didn't know what I was to Greg anymore. I didn't know what I was to Isla. I only knew who I had been, and who I refused to be anymore. The text came late on a Thursday night, just after I'd settled into the quiet of my studio with a cup of tea and an untouched canvas. A simple message from an unknown number. "Hi Marla. This is Troy. Can we talk?" At first, I stared at it, wondering if it was a mistake. Troy had never reached out to me directly. He was always polite, grateful, even, but Isla had always been the bridge between us. For him to reach out now, alone, said more than the words themselves. I didn't answer immediately. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, turned off the lights in the studio. I went to bed. But I didn't sleep. The next morning, I texted back. "Where?" He suggested a diner in Silverwood, halfway between Eastwick and the apartment Isla, and he were now struggling to hold on to. I agreed, even though every part of me screamed to say no, to let them clean up their own mess. But I needed to look the situation in the face. I needed to know how far things had really fallen, and what, if anything, I still had to give. I arrived early, sliding into a booth near the back, the smell of bacon grease and stale coffee lingering in the air like an old tune. Troy walked in 5 minutes later, dressed in jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, eyes sunken with the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from just lack of sleep. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. I nodded but said nothing. Let him speak first. He took a deep breath. "We're behind on rent. Like, really behind. We got a notice. If we don't pay by next Friday, we're out." His voice cracked slightly, and I realized then just how young he still was. 23, maybe. A baby in the adult world, trying to balance life with a woman he adored but clearly didn't know how to rescue. I folded my hands, keeping my tone steady. "Did you ask Celeste?" His face twisted, just a little. "We tried. Isla's texted her. Called. Left voicemails. She hasn't responded." Of course she hadn't. I nodded slowly. "So you came to me." He looked down, embarrassed. "I know it's not fair. I know Isla hurt you, and maybe it's not even my place to ask, but I'm asking. I studied him, the sincerity, the panic he was trying to contain. He reminded me of Isla at 17, when she couldn't figure out how to change a tire and called me crying from a grocery store parking lot. You know what the hardest part of being a mother is? I asked quietly. It's not the diapers or the tantrums or the late nights. It's the letting go. The moment you realize they have to live with the choices they make, and you can't protect them from all the fallout. Troy's eyes met mine, desperate. I know. But it's big. Losing the apartment would wreck her. I don't know what she'll do. I held his gaze for a long beat. She made a choice. At the wedding. She chose the image. The optics. Celeste was the mother in the photos, the speeches, the spotlight. I was the one who paid for everything and then disappeared into the crowd. I know, he whispered. She regrets it, Marla. She doesn't know how to say it, but she does. She thought it was just a gesture. She didn't realize how much it would cut. I believed him. Not because he said the right things, but because I saw it in the slump of his shoulders, the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of the napkin. Isla had regrets. But they had come too late, after the page had already turned. I'm sorry, I said, standing. But I'm not the fallback anymore. Troy stood too, confused. What do you mean? I pulled a 20 from my wallet and left it on the table for my untouched coffee. I mean, I spent nearly 2 decades holding Isla up. Being her constant. I did it without needing a title, without applause. But when she needed to make a choice, she erased me. Marla. She wanted Celeste to have her moment? Fine. Let her have the consequences too. He looked like he wanted to argue, to plead further, but I was already walking away. I didn't turn around. Not when I stepped outside into the sharp morning air, not when I heard the diner door jingle behind me, not even when he called my name one last time. Because this time, I wasn't going back. I drove home in silence, windows down, letting the wind rush over me like a cleansing. For the first time since Isla's wedding, I felt a strange kind of clarity, not coldness, not cruelty, but freedom. I had loved Isla with every corner of my being. I had given and given and given. Now, I was done giving to someone who couldn't see the cost. And maybe, just maybe, it was time I started giving something back to myself. The house was quieter now. Not the gentle kind of quiet I used to treasure, the soft hum of morning, the hush of a book being closed, but an emptiness that settled deep in the bones. Greg had stopped speaking to me beyond the basics. There's more coffee. The trash goes out today. I'll be home late. Cold, factual sentences like we were co-workers in a shared space, not partners in a life once built on love. He blamed me. He didn't say it outright, but I saw it in the way he looked at me. Like I'd let go of a rope he was still gripping with white knuckles. Like I was the reason Isla had been evicted. She had, eventually. The notice had come, and they hadn't scraped together the funds in time. I heard about it from a neighbor of theirs, who'd seen the moving truck and offered condolences in the produce aisle. My breath caught when she mentioned it, but I nodded and thanked her like it was just any other piece of news. At home, Greg paced for hours that night, snapping at a cabinet when it stuck and slamming drawers with too much force. You could have helped, he finally said, low and bitter. And what would that have changed? I snapped, the exhaustion bleeding through every word. She still would have listed me as a guest. Still would have handed Celeste the title like a prize. She was scared, Marla. Confused. Young. She's not a child anymore, I said. She made a choice. And so did I. He didn't answer. Just walked away. The distance between us turned into something more permanent after that. Less of a gap, more of a canyon. And eventually, without saying so, he moved into the guest room. I stopped waiting for him to come back. It was early October when Isla finally reached out. I hadn't heard from her since the call she ended with, I understand. It had been months, and in that time, I'd carefully packed away reminders, the framed photos, the graduation tassel, the handmade, Mimi's favorite mug she'd given me in the 6th grade. I couldn't bear to look at them, not because I didn't love her, but because I did. Because love, when unmet, becomes a kind of grief you have to carry differently. Her message was brief, Can we talk? Oakmere Park? Oakmere. The park where I used to take her on Sundays when Greg was on call and the world was too big for her 5-year-old hands. We'd feed ducks stale bread, climb the play structure shaped like a pirate ship, and make daisy chains on the grass. It had been our place. Our safe little pocket. I said yes, though I didn't know what I was agreeing to. Closure, maybe. Or a deeper wound. The day was crisp, the kind of autumn afternoon that makes you nostalgic whether you want to be or not. I found her by the swings, sitting with her knees pulled up, the hem of her sweater sleeves bunched in her fists like she used to do as a teenager. Her hair was messier, her face thinner. Life had clearly worn down the edges of her honeymoon glow. When she saw me, she stood and smiled, a hesitant, fragile thing. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I replied, standing a few feet away. She shifted on her feet. "Thanks for coming." I nodded, waiting. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry." Her voice cracked, and my stomach twisted, not because I didn't want to hear it, but because I did. Because that word had lived in my imagination for months, wrapped in 1,000 versions of this moment. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she continued, eyes glassy. I thought I was being fair. I thought letting Celeste have that one moment was some kind of balance. I didn't realize it would undo everything. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. "It didn't undo everything," I said quietly. "But it cracked something. Something I thought was solid." She swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to replace you. You didn't just forget me," I said. "You erased me." Her lips parted, and then closed again. Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I want to fix things," she whispered. "I miss you. I miss our talks. I miss having you." I sat down on the bench, and she followed, our shoulders close but not quite touching. "I don't know what fixing looks like," I said honestly. "I can't pretend the wedding didn't happen. I can't erase how it felt sitting in that chair while someone else claimed my years." "I know," she said. "I hate that I let it happen." I turned toward her then, finally meeting her eyes. "You don't get to press a reset button, Isla. Love isn't a faucet you can just turn back on." "But it's still there," she said. "Isn't it?" I looked out at the pond, at the ducks gliding through water speckled with leaves. "Maybe," I said. "But we're not going back to how it was." She nodded slowly, her shoulders curling inward like she knew that already. "I just want a chance," she whispered. I didn't answer right away. I didn't promise anything. But I reached over and gently took her hand in mine. And for now, that had to be enough. The day Greg left was ordinary in every way that made it cruel. There was no final argument, no tears, no grand monologue by the door. He simply packed a weekend bag, the same navy duffel he used for hospital trips, and said, "I think I'll stay at the townhouse for a while." I nodded. Neither of us said what we both knew. He wasn't coming back. He didn't hug me. He didn't even look back. Just the soft click of the door as it closed, and the silence that followed like a vacuum, swallowing whatever was left between us. That was the thing about grief. It didn't always come wrapped in funerals or endings. Sometimes it lived in the sound of a man you once loved walking away without saying goodbye. I stood in the entryway long after he'd gone. The shadows from the living room stretched across the hardwood like fingers I didn't recognize. The house was still, eerily so. No Greg. No Isla. Just me, and the life I had built around loving them. It all collapsed so quietly. In the days that followed, I cleaned. Not in the tidy up for company way, but the desperate, scrubbing the past from surfaces kind of way. I boxed up old photo albums, folded Greg's sweaters, and set them in a drawer I didn't open again. I removed the framed wedding invitation Isla had once given me, her real one, not the formal guest copy. It had been tucked in a keepsake drawer. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't hang it back up either. And then I went to the studio. For the first time in months, I let myself sit in front of a blank canvas and not think about what I was supposed to paint. I just moved the brush, letting my grief become color. Grays, burnt orange, deep blue. All the things I couldn't say to Greg, to Isla, to myself. It felt like breathing again after being underwater for too long. Eastwick had always been a town that felt like it belonged in a novel. Old brick bookstores, ivy crawling over lampposts, coffee shops where people still knew your name. I wandered through it with new eyes now, bumping into neighbors I hadn't seen in years, sipping lattes in silence, letting conversations drift around me like soft music. I started reconnecting with people. An old friend from an art class invited me to a gallery opening. A neighbor asked if I'd teach her daughter to paint. Slowly, gently, I stepped back into the version of myself I'd buried beneath motherhood and marriage. Not because I didn't love those parts of my life, but because they had become the whole of me for so long. And now they weren't. One morning, after a long walk through the Eastwick Arboretum, I returned home to find a message on my phone. No missed call, just a voicemail and a text. The name on the screen made my breath catch. Isla. I hesitated, staring at it for a moment. The weight of that name, the history folded into 4 simple letters, had changed shape in my chest. It used to be warmth, then hurt. Now, I wasn't sure. I opened the message first. It was short. No emojis. No filters. You were always my mother. I'm sorry I didn't see it until too late. I read it again. And again. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't reply. Not yet. I played the voicemail next. Her voice was softer than I remembered, and shakier. Hi, Mimi. Mom. I was thinking about that time you drove 3 hours just to bring me my favorite soup when I had the flu in college. And the time you stayed up all night sewing sequins on my dance costume because I forgot to tell you it was due the next morning. You've always been there, and I don't know why I couldn't say that in the moment it mattered most. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love you. She hung up before the beep. I sat on the edge of the couch, phone still in my hand, heart aching in a way that wasn't sharp anymore, just heavy. There had been a time I would have rushed to her, replied immediately, forgiven without question. That time had passed. Not because I didn't love her, but because love, real love, required boundaries. And I had finally found mine. I didn't respond. Not yet. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I needed to honor the quiet I'd worked so hard to find. I went into the studio and painted for hours that day. The canvas bloomed with new colors, softer this time. Pale pink, silver, streaks of hopeful yellow. Not joy, not yet, but something adjacent. Peace. And when I stood back and looked at it, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Whole. Not because someone needed me. Not because I was being called Mom or Mimi or asked to show up. But because I had chosen to stay with myself. To honor the love I gave, even when it wasn't returned. The message had come too late. But peace? Peace had arrived right on time.